Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today, I'm delighted to have with me Helen Blaikie. Helen is an interim chief data officer, data strategist, and one of our wonderful associates working with us at Cynozure with our customers on building and delivering data strategies. Helen, welcome along to the show.
Thank you, Jason.
No problem. So we're going to talk about data literacy today. Your pet subject, I believe, and more specifically, how do we think about it? How do we improve data literacy, and sort of with the end goal being empowering people to create and use insights to sort of ultimately help make better decisions. So before we get into that topic, let's hear a bit more about you and your background and how you got into data, because it's once again it's a slightly different journey to many people I have on this show.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Jason, and good morning, everybody. I've worked in the data and analytics space, I guess, for over 10 years now, leading data teams. But that's in addition to my core skill set as a finance director. So typically, I think chief data officers tend to either rise up through information governance or IT or marketing, and the last strand, I think, is through finance. Finance people love a KPI, they love a metric, they love measuring things and providing insights. So I guess that's where I came into the journey. It was at the time when business intelligence and data wasn't really a thing, so nobody knew where to put it. So anybody who liked a number, I think it just got thrown in their area. So I was given it first time 10 years ago at National Express, and I've moved throughout my career across lots of sectors. I've been very lucky, really, I guess, in finance and in data. Your skills are very transferable across sectors. So I've been lucky enough to work in most sectors, from public sector, education, transport, distribution, power generation, manufacturing, FMCG, and latterly financial services as well. So a real cross sector experience, which just makes life interesting. Different problems to solve in every organization with some underlying key themes.
Yeah, well, like data, finance is kind of a foundation. It's horizontal across a business. It touches all parts of the organization. So I can imagine some parallels that you've seen. It's interesting because the data did and has and still does, to be fair, sit with the finance department in a number of organizations. And certainly 10 15 years ago, when it was just the numbers, just kind of creating performance reports and things like that often sat with the finance department. Therefore they were kind of steering the strategy for how you improve data so that they could improve the performance reporting. And so I can imagine there's sort of a career of learning without realizing it around data before you sort of officially, if you like, moved into the data roles.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you say, I think you tend to move through the typical analytics steps. So in terms of reporting on what's been already, and finance people love to do that. And then also in terms of forecasting as well and what's going to happen. I guess the area where a finance person, where I've really had to learn, because it's not really the comfort zone of a typical finance person, is really in that analytics space. So the predictive and the prescriptive type analytics, in terms of how do we really understand the true value of our data to be able to, for example, organize next best action initiatives, customer experience initiatives, and all of those things that can be really powerful for the organization. And they do actually generate revenue as the ultimate outcome. But actually there's a lot more measures before you get to the revenue that the finance people are interested in.
Yeah, I guess the data thing has become broader than financial metrics, right? I think that's the big difference, and more than financial reporting and more than financial forecasting. There's kind of, you've got that concept across all parts of the organization, monetary and not monetary. So yeah, I can see where there's a slight difference, but that underlying experience of needing to know, understand, and I guess also the kind of, and it depends on the kind of FD CFO that exists, but the kind of the idea that you're either supporting the organization or you're strategically driving them forward. And I think there's a bit of a discussion about where the CDO sits, and I think it's probably quite similar in the finance world. You're either providing a service to help the organization run its finances and operate, or you're being a strategic advisor to the board and the organization of how we drive the business forward.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think some of it comes from the levels of maturity within the organization to a degree, because I think when people first start on their data journey, there's often a trigger. That trigger can often be more a risk-based approach. So they've had a breach, for example, so therefore they need to do something with their data. So it becomes more about data security and privacy, and it's very much a defensive strategy. But then once all of that is in place and they have good solid foundations, then you tend to find, or I've certainly found in organizations, they tend to think then more towards the innovative side of data and analytics. And that's really the fun stuff. That's when you can really start to unpick an organization and demonstrate some real value.
Yeah. So is there excuse me, is there kind of parallels between financial literacy and data literacy then? So if I think about how an organization and managers and senior leaders need to have a level of financial literacy to run their part of the business, understand their profit and loss, make better sort of purchasing decisions, put business cases together from a sort of financial literacy perspective. And then you've got data literacy, which we'll get onto what it is, but is there sort of some parallels and can things be learned from that kind of financial literacy that either does or doesn't exist in an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some key themes from whether it's financial literacy, data literacy, or even any other discipline within an organization. I think one of the key themes is that one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah.
So that actually you really need to understand the needs of the individuals based on their roles and what they need to deliver, and then really tailor the approach to them. So as an example, going back to my days in the finance world over 20 years ago now, I was working for Michelin and I spent a lot of time running training courses, finance for non-financial managers.
Brilliant. Right.
We made it fun. We made it a game to talk them through the profit and loss, etc. But that really resonated with all of the sales teams who I was supporting at that time, to really enable them to understand. Now, that approach was great for them, but with the senior execs, it was more a one-to-one coaching and talking them through their numbers and helping them to become familiar and empowering them to be confident to talk around the numbers. And it's exactly the same with data. And that's certainly an approach that we can come on to later in terms of how we really start to develop data literacy within organizations.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Well, I suppose the first question is why is this important? So why do we, financial literacy, you can kind of understand it's the numbers, it's about the money, it's ultimately where a lot of businesses, start and fail and succeed. Data literacy, is it the same? Is it as important? Why do we need to care about this? Why do we need to care about getting data into the hands of people and insights into the hands of people?
I guess it's if we look over the last few years, and COVID is a great example of this, as people have moved more from an offline platform, particularly in retail, to online, and the way that consumers behave these days and customers behave, the digitization of companies has just meant that there's certainly an opportunity, because there's so much data everywhere, and that digital footprint can actually be used in positive and of course within the realms of data ethics, but certainly be used to start to develop some great strategies for organizations to be able to get closer to their customers and offer them a more personalized approach. I think the government was a great example with their daily COVID updates. They really did a lot for the data industry in terms of what a good visualization looks like and what a bad visualization looks like. Indeed, yeah. But that was a great opportunity to really show the power of data. People want to understand where they are and where they want to go. So actually, data gives you that opportunity. We can have more insight than ever before.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, aside from the sometimes dodgy data visualizations that we saw, the literacy part for me really was, my kids and my wife and my mum talking about the data around COVID. That for me was kind of literacy, because there was a sort of an understanding and a care about us making our life decisions based on the data and the data that were
Absolutely.
being shared, and then you get into the whole discussion about, well, if we get it shared, the right data, and is it sort of clear enough about how it's being presented. But just the fact that people were making their day-to-day decisions about going out, about staying in, about meeting up, about not meeting up based on data, I think that, as you say, it really kind of helped lift the data literacy of the world, but UK PLC. So yeah, I think it's a great example. It's a great example. Yeah. Is data literacy more than, so you sort of gave some examples of training before, but is it more than just sort of training people on how to use data?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's training is always one tool in your armory to be able to develop any skill, but it's certainly wider than that. I mean, in terms of data literacy, it's if you take the standard definition, the ability to read, write, communicate with data, that feels quite complicated, but it's actually being able to. It's empowering people to be able to use data and to be comfortable with data. That doesn't always come from training. That can come from talking about data within meetings, for example. So senior leadership buy-in is absolutely key to any data literacy program. It needs to be sponsored by the senior executives, and they need to be the ones that are pushing the conversations around, show me the data, let's speak data, what does the data tell us? These are the sorts of words that you would typically hear in a very data literate boardroom. So I think it's wider than just training. In terms of approaches, there's on-the-job learning is really important. So give people access to data, and once they start to use it, then they start to become literate because they can play with it. It's in their hands. So actually making the data accessible is really, really important. So there's lots of enablers to data literacy. The quality of the data, for example, has to be in a good state, but sometimes it's quite good to surface the data first to show the data quality so that actually then people understand why it's important.
Yeah, it's kind of a balance, isn't it? You want to demonstrate the quality, but you don't want to worry people that it's not good enough. But you need to know that it's not good enough because there's a cycle of making it better in order to then use it for insights. But what's some of the other enablers actually? So just while we're on that, so you kind of got, you mentioned the quality. You mentioned about kind of top down kind of language that's used around the use of data. I like this idea of the data literate boardroom. What's some of these other enablers that are required in order to create an organization that is data literate?
So I think the starting point is to have some sort of foundation of a data platform. It doesn't have to be a huge enterprise data platform that has every single system in there. I advocate starting small. So try and understand the business problem. What is the business problem you're trying to solve? And then try and build out a data product around that. And once you have that, you can really demonstrate the value of the data through what we call a use case. So what is that problem and how do we solve that problem? I've done that recently with at the university, where actually we've defined the recruitment journey is really, really, really important to the university. They had some legacy systems. So we moved on to a Power BI platform. We gave the data to the hands of the users, and that's really transformed their journey. They now know when they can close a course because they can understand the lead times and the people who are applying for those courses. So making it really relevant is absolutely important. Unless it's relevant to everybody, it won't land. It absolutely won't land. You have to have a very tailored approach.
Yeah, so I think you talked there about sort of having a platform that's got the right data in it, but focusing that platform on a use case like the university example you gave there, but also you sort of touched on putting this in the hands of the people that are ultimately making the decisions. Now, I think that part is arguably where data literacy comes into its own. That's rather than that being the enabler, that's like the end point that you want to try and get to. But I think without that kind of, but I suppose it's a question actually. Can an organization only be data literate if data is ultimately in the hands of the people that are day to day operating and running and making strategic decisions about the business, or can an organization be data literate if there is a body of people that are making, that are using data to help and guide and influence, even if it's not sort of roots and branches in the organization?
It's an interesting question, isn't it, really? I think there is a danger sometimes when you put information and data in the hands of everybody within the organization, because sometimes you can get data chaos if you have it contained within a centralized team. As long as that team are trusted and the data is trusted and it's a single source of the truth, I think there is an element of data literacy. I think data literacy is a spectrum in terms of how empowered people are with the data. I think it's still, people can still be data literate as long as they can understand the data that they're given. They might not be using it themselves, so it might not be self-service. But the key is, do they understand that data? Are they making decisions from that data?
Yeah.
And can they tell the story? Storytelling is really, really important around the data.
Yeah.
And those are probably some of the key things that can be done, regardless of where that data is produced.
I think, you hit something really important there, which is you're empowering decision making with data. So regardless of whether you've centralized the creation of and even the development of the insight, or disconnected it from the people that are ultimately making the decisions, what is needed is an organization that can make decisions based on data that they see and are presented and or create themselves. And so decision making feels like that's sort of maybe missing from the definition actually of data literacy that you gave, which I know is a standard sort of industry one, but it sort of feels like data literacy is really about enabling people to make decisions based on data. And then how you get to that end point, who does it and how it's set up. And, it's almost secondary, the kind of the how, the end point needs to be, we're making decisions. And as you mentioned the language earlier, we're looking at data to drive our decision making. That's the important thing when it comes to literacy. Is that where you think this is heading?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's, are you using data to make decisions? I think there are probably some other indicators, and I guess we're moving into the how do you measure the data literacy of an organization. But one of the other key things is data actually an integral part of the organization and not just a byproduct? So what I mean by that, for example, is if you have a project within the organization to implement a new operational system, are the project team and the IT guys coming to the data team to really understand what is needed up front? And that's one of the key indicators. That was a shift I saw in a previous organization when I was at HomeServe, where actually typically what would happen previously before we had a voice was a system would be developed and then they would have the go, no-go decision and say, well, what about the reporting? Oh, we forgot to speak to the data guys. And it was really an afterthought. So then you either go live without the reporting or you delay. So then it felt like it was our issue because actually
that's caused the delay.
Whereas we turn that around and we put some processes in place so that actually at the very start of a project the data team are included, and that's data literacy as well, because actually people are thinking about what they need for data. It's not just decision making, it's also, is it included within your processes? Or even if somebody's inputting data at the front end, at the level of data entry, there's an element of data literacy. Do they understand that they need to put something in the right way? Because if they don't, by the time you get to analysing that data, the data isn't in a fit state to be able to analyse. So it's when I talk about spectrums, it can be all the way through from somebody inputting data all the way through to the boardroom, which is really quite fascinating. And that's what I love about data literacy and how it engages the whole organisation.
It's a real cultural and or mindset shift, isn't it? I think it's moves from the as you say, byproduct. It moves from just something that there's an insights team that's creating insights, and it becomes pervasive. It's sort of all encompassing, and if it's all encompassing, for it to be all encompassing in a positive way, of course, then there needs to be that level of literacy up and down and across the organization.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. This is change management, as anything is, where you're putting in new systems, but it really is a cultural shift. So you will get those people who will come with you straight away, and then you can adopt one approach for those guys, and then there might be the people who are just not sure. So it's almost different methods of cracking the nut for the different personas, really.
Yeah, let's dig into that a bit more then. The sort of methods, the approaches. How do we? So if we sort of put a pin in that the literacy is about helping the organisation make better decisions, and we've got some enablers around to do that, around technology platforms, around making sure data's available, about culturally and mindset wise people get this stuff, and we've got good processes and controls in place. What are some of the approaches to then sort of creating the literacy in the organization?
So we talked about training. Training is always a key part. Some people don't feel like they have been dipped in data literacy unless they've been on a training course. So absolutely, training, classroom learning, CBT type of things is really, really important. Shows and tells are really important. Coming back to those use cases, demonstrating the value of the product by taking people through what they can do with the data, what that means, and then letting them go and have a play. So I would say typically probably around 10% of the data literacy programs tend to be around training. The other
is that training just on training? Because I think there's sort of levels here. I've seen quite a few, and they bubble into the press, actually, certainly the industry press, and if not further, around, I remember a few years back, my ex employer M&S launched a data literacy program, but essentially what it looked like from the outside anyway was training a whole bunch of people in SQL and doing analytics. And I just wonder, is that what data literacy is about? Training people to code and sort of the mechanics and the engineering of data, and maybe some analytics, or is it broader than that when we talk about training and education?
So I think for some people, yes. For the people who are deep in analytics and need that, absolutely, that could be an approach.
So more analysts, basically, is good for literacy in an organization. So that's cool. And then for those people, so what you're saying, for those people, of course, if someone's interested and wants to, then more of those is a good thing. But that's not all it is. I feel like you're going to say.
No, absolutely. So we talked about data personas before. So I think when you're starting to develop a data literacy plan, I like to look at what are the personas in the organization. So it might be an executive manager, it might be, as you say, the analysts and the specialists. And along that spectrum, it's very much different needs that they have. Training a board director in SQL, R, or Python probably won't hit the spot, if I'm honest. But what they really need to know is they probably need some one-to-one coaching in terms of how do I understand the data for my areas so that I can achieve my strategic objectives. So that might be a bit of coaching, for example. So I think it's very, very different methods for different areas. As an example, I know an organization that has had a data buddy mentoring program. So what they do is they take people from the data and analytics team and they buddy them up with an executive. And what they do then, the executive will mentor them in terms of how the business works and the understanding of the business. And then in return, the junior members of the team then actually mentor the exec on being able to understand their data and what that means and enabling them to storytell. And I think that's a really, really powerful way of improving data literacy, whilst also developing some of the softer skills for both sets of team members as well.
Yeah, love that. Really good. So the training side is, as you say, tailored for the what's required for sort of different levels or different personas, really, rather than hierarchical, but different personas. In different situations. Is there anything beyond than training in terms of those approaches to sort of really getting literacy into an organization?
Absolutely, Jason. I think communication, having a strong, robust communication plan is key. This is iterative, and you have to talk about data all the time. So the typical things like blogs, for example, and sharing successes enables people to understand what we're doing. Those are good things. Things like having, if you use Yammer or those sorts of social media type of things, getting people to engage via forums is really good. When at National Express, when we started on our journey with Click at the time, we set up Click cafes. So we would demonstrate some products at lunchtime. We'd bring coffee and cake. So a real incentive for people to come along. Yeah. It's always good to have coffee and cake. And then they would be able to come along and see new data products on a regular basis and really start to ask some questions in a very social environment. So that's social learning. Well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That social environment is really important to be able to do it and just make it not as dull as training can be sometimes.
Yeah, well, yeah, quite. All of those things you said are miles away from training people in SQL and building dashboards. Those bits you talk about there are really about the sort of last mile. It's about right now. It's about how do we understand data and make decisions with it, and you've got to find interesting ways to make that happen. So I think that you sort of combine there sort of that social learning and show and tells. We at one organization I worked with a few years back, we set up did you know sessions, and the did you know sessions were sort of the data function finding some interesting insight about the business and essentially showing and telling it, saying, did you know that we're not very good here? Did you know that we've done really great performance here? Did you know that our margins are a bit lower here than they should be? Did you know that this product set is performing really well in this country, but not this country? So it was did you know sessions. And then as they got sort of more sort of embedded and mature, they started to twist to really you should know sessions.
Yes.
And then what beyond there obviously is that people then have the appetite to go and sort of investigate and unearth this stuff themselves. So I like that idea of social learning, bit of carrot, bit of stick, sort of helps to drive the thinking forward.
Yeah, and it's really interesting actually when you say the did you know, that leads into another point really around ensuring that you've got your HR team on board so that when you're recruiting people, you make sure that you have some reference to data within the organization because it within their role profiles, because it's a key skill. And then you can develop the levels using those personas, ensuring that every job description has an element of data literacy in there, understanding the competencies, and then you can start doing some gap analysis and understand what the real training needs are. So that's really when you are very data mature to ensure that you're doing that.
Well, yeah, again, another sort of phrase and term and thing that sort of talked about in the industry is a data culture. There's something really kind of like final about in every job spec, or not even job spec, but every assessment you make of a new recruit, having some element of ability to understand and make decisions with data. And some of the best organizations I've spoken to are at the kind of the kind of more advanced end of even just mindset wise of data and really data literate organizations. They won't recruit people. They literally won't recruit people that aren't thinking that way, haven't got experience of making decisions that way, because they know that's going to slow them down when it comes to kind of making decisions. And they want their organization to be flexible and agile. In order to be able to do that, they need to use data to do that. So I think that's it's a really great one there. And I think involvement, that's a great sort of catch there, sort of involvement with HR and hiring managers and the values of the business, actually, and the culture of the business to embed this much more tightly.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. And you mentioned another point as well about recruiting people with those certain skills, and some things, asking good questions and having a curiosity around the business is something that's really key to progressing data literacy in organizations. And sometimes that's quite difficult for managers, for leaders, because they've not really had to do that, because they've not had the data at their fingertips. So sometimes that is it takes some time to develop.
Yeah.
But I think these days, with more access to data in the wider world rather than just in organizations, as young people are coming through the organizations, they tend to have more of those skills, which is great.
Yeah.
And certainly teaching these skills in schools, I think, is the starting point really to developing good data literate employees and leaders of the future.
Yeah, and there's some great work by a number of organisations that's doing that, and it's grassroots, school through GCSE, through A levels, or the equivalent in whatever country you're in. That's the UK standard, but into university and higher education, because I think people start to sort of focus in a bit on certain topic areas and subjects a little bit more at university, but the kind of the understanding that across all programs in higher education, not just the data ones, probably should have some form of data literacy. The financial, also the finance and accounting sort of programs, they definitely have data literacy within them, but does the geography ones, do the marketing degrees, do they all have that element of sort of baking in the understanding of data in them to ensure that these are data literate as well as sort of functional literate in the roles that they go into? What are to sort of start to thinking about sort of drawing the conversation to a close, but I think there's a lot there, right? There is so many things, there's so many strands. There's sort of education, there's culture change, there's mindset shifts, there's so many stuff there. It feels like this isn't easy, and we've seen working together and in customers and talking to lots of different chief data officers in the industry that this isn't easy. But what's some of the kind of biggest challenges to getting this right, or even having the platform or the sort of right to do it?
I think some of the key challenges are, we talked about exec sponsorship and senior advocates within the organization, and it has to start from the top. I think sometimes if you start bottom up, you don't land the program in the way that perhaps you should. So I think having that almost data cheerleader in the boardroom. I love the term data cheerleader, because I really think you need somebody who's shouting about data all the time. Definitely. And it's champion. And they often come from marketing. If you don't have a CDO, they might actually come from finance. And so having one of those and linking, I think, to specific use cases as well is really important, because I've seen data literacy programs where, and I've actually been part of them, where we've suddenly decided we're going to make everybody data literate. We're going to launch an enterprise program, and we don't really know what we're telling them. So you get lots of people in the room and they just think, well, what's in it for me? Why is this relevant to me? So I think actually starting small, getting your champions on board through demonstrating value through use cases, and then they become your advocates. And then it's almost tribal leadership. I love the tribal leadership approach, where you just take pockets and you start to filter through the organization rather than embarking on an enterprise-wide program initially, which might work, but for that you need some really good solid foundations that we've spoken about before. So I would advocate starting small, and that will overcome some of the challenges that perhaps you see. The other thing is, I think sometimes there are people who are just not comfortable with data because they've never had to do it. And this is where the change management piece comes in. Focus your efforts on the runners and the joggers rather than the people who actually don't want to get there. And I think that's absolutely key as well, focusing your efforts on the people who will come with you and make it a success, because this is a people thing, right? It's not technology. It's, yes, there's some process as well, but it's mainly people. It's all about people and enacting change and cultural change through people.
Which can be challenging, which can be tough. So cool. So it's been fascinating talking to you and hearing some of your experiences. It's interesting, data literacy as a topic, because it cuts across all of the things you need to do with data, sort of such a broad topic. Literacy is kind of like something that floats over the top about creating an organization that is literate. But in order to do that, you need to have all these other building blocks in place, and a strong strategy and a great team and great buy-in and all these things that you talked about. So it's one of those topics that isn't kind of let's just do data literacy. It's kind of, it needs to be backed up by a whole load of things. So it's been great talking to you about those things, and yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jason. I've really enjoyed it.
No problem. And thanks everyone for listening. Hope we've sparked some thinking about literacy and creating an organization that can make decisions with data. So we'll catch you again soon.